Raymond Ellis, a homeless veteran, collapses in court while testifying about an overheard confession in a property dispute. Mocked as a vagrant, his past as a decorated soldier who saved 17 lives in Kosovo remains hidden. A small American flag and bronze star pinned to his tattered jacket hint at his heroism. As whispers of doubt fill the courtroom, Judge Arthur Bell, who served with him, recognizes Raymond's sacrifice. Sarah Martinez, a young intern, finds Raymond's notebook revealing a connection to Bell. What secret binds them? Will the truth about Raymond's past reshape the town's judgment? Subscribe to our channel, share your thoughts, and tell us where you are watching from. Together, let's ensure courage is never overlooked. Support our mission to give a voice to those whose stories deserve to be remembered. The bailiff's voice sliced through the courtroom's tense air, sharp and accusing. "He's faking it again," he bellowed, his words dripping with skepticism. Raymond Ellis, a man weathered by time and hardship, felt his knees buckle beneath him, no longer able to bear the weight of his trembling body or the scrutiny of the room. His frail form crumpled to the hardwood floor with a dull thud that echoed in the stunned silence. Pain radiated through his bones, but it was the sting of the bailiff's accusation that cut deeper, lodging in his chest like a shard of glass. No one stirred, not the attorneys frozen mid-motion, not the spectators craning their necks, not even the Wilson family, whose futures hung on the testimony of this broken man. All eyes turned to Judge Arthur Bell, who rose slowly from his polished bench, his face a mask of unreadable steel. His voice, when it came, was low but carried the weight of authority. "This courtroom owes him more than silence," he declared, his words hanging in the air like a challenge. Who was this tattered figure? This man in rags who had collapsed under the gaze of Milfield's justice system? And what secret did the judge hold? A memory that seemed to flicker behind his stoic eyes, known only to him. Raymond Ellis had been the unofficial guardian of the Milfield County Courthouse steps for precisely 1,247 days. At 62, his hands bore the scars of relentless labor and exposure to the elements, cracked, calloused, etched with the story of a life lived on the margins. His back, permanently bowed from years of sleeping on cold concrete, ached with every movement, yet he carried himself with a quiet dignity that few noticed. Each morning, as the first light of dawn crept over the sleepy town, Raymond arrived at 6 a.m. sharp, armed with a frayed mop and a dented bucket. No one had hired him, no one paid him a dime. The courthouse, with its grand columns in weathered stone, had become his sanctuary, a place where he could pour his fractured soul into something resembling purpose. To the locals, he was simply Ray the Mop. Some spoke his nickname with a warmth reserved for familiar fixtures, like an old oak in the town square. Others muttered it with a weary sigh, their patience worn thin by the sight of a man who refused to vanish into the shadows. On this crisp Tuesday morning in October, something about Raymond was different. His tattered jacket, patched and threadbare, hung on his slight frame as always, but a new detail caught the eye. A small, folded piece of cloth tied loosely around his neck. He touched it often, his fingers trembling as they brushed against the fabric, as if it held a memory too heavy to carry, but too precious to let go. Inside Courtroom 3, a heated property dispute unfolded. The Wilson family fighting to reclaim their grandmother's home, which they claimed had been swindled from her during a vulnerable moment in the hospital. Raymond had no intention of being drawn into their battle. He was a man who preferred the sidelines, content to scrub away the world's dirt and leave its conflicts to others. But 3 weeks prior, while cleaning the courthouse fountain, its gentle gurgle masking his presence, he had overheard a conversation that changed everything. Daniel Morrison, the man who had purchased the Wilson home, had admitted to his lawyer in a hushed, smug tone that he knew the elderly woman was not in her right mind when he sealed the deal. The words had struck Raymond like a lightning bolt, stirring a sense of duty he thought had long since withered. The Wilson family's attorney, a determined young woman with sharp eyes, had tracked Raymond down to his makeshift bed behind the Dairy Queen, where the hum of the freezer drowned out the world. She had pleaded with him to testify, her voice earnest but tinged with pity as she looked at the man before her, unkempt, unshaven, yet somehow resolute. Raymond had hesitated, his heart pounding with the fear of stepping into a world that had long ago cast him out. But the thought of the Wilson grandmother, alone and betrayed, gnawed at him until he agreed. Now, as he sat in the back row of the courtroom, the folded cloth at his throat felt like a noose, tightening with every whisper that rippled through the crowd. "What's he doing here?" one woman hissed, her voice laced with disdain. "They're letting homeless people in courtrooms now?" another muttered, as if Raymond's presence defiled the sanctity of the room. "Someone ought to check if he's been drinking," a man added, his words sharp enough to draw blood. Raymond kept his eyes fixed on the floor, his hands clasped tightly in his lap, trying to anchor himself against the rising tide of judgment. Judge Arthur Bell presided over the proceedings with the precision of a conductor leading a symphony. At 58, he was a figure of formidable presence, his gray hair meticulously combed, his black robes pristine, his reputation as unyielding as the gavel he wielded. Known for his fairness, Bell was equally notorious for his emotional restraint. His courtroom, a place where theatrics found no purchase. To him, justice was a machine, and he its meticulous operator. The case had unfolded smoothly until the moment Raymond was called to the stand. He rose slowly, his joints creaking like the hinges of an ancient door, and shuffled toward the witness stand. The room fell silent, not out of reverence, but out of morbid curiosity, as if the spectators were watching a sideshow rather than a man about to speak truth. "State your name for the record," the clerk instructed. Her tone clipped. "Raymond Ellis," he replied, his voice soft and rough, like sandpaper worn thin by years of silence. "And where do you live, Mr. Ellis?" she pressed. Raymond's gaze flickered, his throat tightening. Around town. Various places," he said, the words heavy with the weight of his reality. A ripple of murmurs spread through the room, punctuated by a loud whisper from the gallery. "Homeless guy. This should be good." The cruelty of the comment pierced Raymond, but he stood straighter, determined to hold his ground. When he began his testimony, Raymond's voice steadied, his words clear and deliberate. He recounted the conversation he had overheard by the fountain, detailing Morrison's confession with a precision that surprised even himself. His memory, unclouded by the chaos of his life, was a steel trap, capturing every inflection, every damning word. But as he spoke, his body betrayed him. His breathing grew labored, each inhale a struggle against the tightening in his chest. Beads of sweat glistened on his forehead, defying the courtroom's cool air. The defense attorney, a man with a predatory glint in his eye, seized the moment to pounce. "Isn't it true, Mr. Ellis, that you've been living on the streets for several years?" he asked, his tone dripping with condescension. "Yes, sir," Raymond replied, his voice quiet but firm. "And isn't it possible that your circumstances might affect your ability to recall events accurately?" The question was a trap designed to discredit him. Raymond's hand drifted to the cloth at his throat, his fingers tracing its edges as if seeking strength. "My circumstances don't affect my hearing, sir," he said, his words carrying a quiet defiance that silenced the room for a moment. But the attorney pressed on, relentless. "Surely you understand that your credibility might be questioned given your lifestyle choices." The phrase landed like a blow, each syllable a reminder of the world's rejection. Raymond's breathing grew shallow, his chest heaving as if the air itself had turned against him. The courtroom felt stifling, the fluorescent lights too bright, the weight of every stare crushing his resolve. "I don't," he began, but the words caught in his throat. His hands gripped the witness stand, knuckles blanching as he fought to stay upright. His vision swam, the faces before him blurring into a sea of judgment. "Mr. Ellis," Judge Bell's voice cut through the haze, steady but laced with concern. "Are you all right?" Raymond opened his mouth to respond, but no sound came. His heart pounded, a frantic rhythm that drowned out everything else. The cloth at his throat felt heavier than ever, a tether to a past he could neither escape nor reclaim. And then, as the room spun, his knees gave way, and he fell, the world fading into darkness. The frayed cloth cinched around Raymond Ellis's neck felt like a noose, tightening with every breath. It wasn't just fabric, it carried the weight of 8 years spent on the streets, unseen, unheard, and burdened by truths too heavy for anyone to believe. Each moment of those years pressed down on him now, a tidal wave of memories and regrets that made his chest constrict. His legs gave way, trembling under the strain of a life that had once held purpose, but now seemed to mock him. Raymond, a man who had once cradled a Purple Heart and pinned a bronze star to his chest, a man who had pulled 17 souls from the jaws of death in Kosovo, crumpled to the courtroom floor. The sound of his body hitting the polished wood echoed like a gunshot, raw and final. The bailiff, a burly man with a permanent scowl, reacted first, not with compassion, but with suspicion. "He's pulling another stunt," he bellowed, his voice dripping with disdain. To him, Raymond was just another vagrant, a master of manipulation clawing for pity. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs, a mix of shock and skepticism rippling through the spectators. Heads turned, eyes narrowed, but no one moved. No one knelt beside the fallen man to check his pulse or see if his chest still rose and fell. They watched, frozen, as if his collapse was a performance they'd paid to judge, not a crisis demanding humanity. Raymond lay there alone in a sea of stares, his shallow breaths unnoticed, his dignity stripped bare. High above the case, Judge Arthur Bell sat at his bench, his face a mask of stoic calm. But something in Raymond's fall stirred him, a flicker of recognition or perhaps unease that no one else caught. Slowly, deliberately, he rose, his black robes trailing behind him like a shadow. The courtroom fell silent, the air thick with anticipation. This was a man known for his unyielding demeanor, a judge who rarely stepped beyond the boundaries of his role. Yet now he descended from his perch, each step measured, his expression unreadable, but heavy with intent. The crowd held its breath as he approached Raymond's still form, their whispers fading into a tense hush. Kneeling beside the crumpled figure, Judge Bell gently turned Raymond over, his hand steady but careful, as if handling something fragile. That's when he saw it. The cloth around Raymond's neck wasn't just a rag. It was a small, faded American flag, its edges worn thin from years of reverent care. Tucked inside, hidden from the world but pressed close to Raymond's heart, gleamed a bronze star medal, its surface dulled but unmistakable. The sight hit Bell like a quiet thunderclap, stirring questions he couldn't yet voice. Who was this man really? And what had brought him to this moment of collapse, not just in body but in spirit? Within hours, the scene was no longer confined to the courtroom. Cell phone videos of Raymond's fall spread like wildfire across the internet, each clip capturing a different angle. The homeless man crumpling, the judge rising, the crowd standing idle. But the footage lacked context, and the online world rushed to fill the void with its own stories. Comment sections erupted with vitriol and speculation. "Just another bum faking a heart attack for attention," one user sneered. "Why'd the judge even bother? What's he hiding?" another demanded. Some saw conspiracy, others saw pathos, but few saw Raymond as a man with a past worth understanding. The internet painted him as a caricature, pathetic, manipulative, or both, while the truth remained buried beneath the noise. Local news outlets latched onto the story, but their coverage was shallow, predictable. "Homeless man disrupts court proceedings," the headlines blared, framing Raymond's collapse as an inconvenience, a delay in the pursuit of justice. Reporters speculated about whether vagrants like him should even be allowed in courtrooms, their words laced with disdain for the unseen lives they barely acknowledged. But behind the scenes, three people refused to let the story end there, driven by curiosity, empathy, or something deeper they couldn't yet name. Sarah Martinez, a 25-year-old legal intern, spent her evenings scrubbing the courthouse floors to fund her law school dreams. She'd noticed Raymond before, his quiet routine of sweeping the steps, sitting on the same bench, watching the world with eyes that seemed to see too much. His collapse shook her, not just because of its suddenness, but because of the way no one else seemed to care. After the incident, she dug into his background, expecting to find at least a trace of his past. But his military records were either classified or missing entirely, a void where answers should have been. "It's strange," she told her supervisor, her brow furrowed with unease. "It's like he's a ghost in the system. No one just disappears like that." Online, the story took on a life of its own. A Facebook group called Milfield Truth branded Raymond a fraud, accusing him of stolen valor and parading unearned medals for sympathy. Their posts were filled with scorn, dismissing him as a con artist who'd mastered the art of deception. But another group, led by local veterans, wasn't so quick to judge. Tom Hartley, a Gulf War veteran who ran the American Legion post, saw something in Raymond that didn't align with the homeless stereotype. "I've known men who came back shattered," he wrote on his blog, his words heavy with experience. "But there's a way some carry themselves, even in their lowest moments. It's in the spine, the eyes. This man has it. You don't fake that kind of weight." The most cryptic clue came from an unlikely source. Buried in the comments of a viral video amid a flood of hateful speculation, a user named Bravo9999 posted a single haunting line. "If he's still alive, then we weren't left behind after all." The words sent a chill down Sarah's spine when she screenshot them, sensing they held a truth no one else had grasped. But within hours, the comment vanished, as if its author regretted letting it slip into the world. Raymond, meanwhile, remained silent as the storm raged around him. After his collapse, he'd been rushed to the county hospital, treated for dehydration and exhaustion, and released the next day with nowhere to go. The world's sudden fascination with him felt like a violation, a spotlight he'd spent years avoiding. He returned to his routine as if nothing had changed, cleaning the courthouse steps, sitting on his bench, watching life pass by with a quiet resignation. When reporters swarmed him, their microphones thrust forward like weapons, he deflected them with a soft but firm no comment, his voice steady but hollow. That night, alone behind the courthouse, Raymond sat with a tattered notebook he'd carried for years, its pages filled with fragments of a life he no longer claimed. Under the dim glow of a street lamp, he scrawled a single line. "Nobody needs to know," but the sentence trailed off, unfinished, as if the weight of his secrets was too much to put into words. In that moment, he wasn't a hero or a homeless man, a fraud or a forgotten soldier. He was just Raymond, carrying a story no one was ready to hear, and a heart that still beat despite it all. The first light of dawn hadn't yet broken over the city when Sarah Martinez stepped onto the courthouse steps, her breath visible in the chilly morning air. As a part-time janitor and legal intern, she was used to starting her day before most people had even stirred. Her cleaning shift demanded early hours, and she prided herself on her quiet efficiency. But today, something disrupted her routine. There, half hidden in the shadow of the steps, lay a worn notebook, its edges frayed as if it had been carried through years of hardship. Sarah's first instinct was practical. She bent down, picked it up, and dusted it off, assuming someone had lost it in the chaos of the previous day. Her fingers traced the cover, searching for a name, an address, anything to help return it to its owner. What she found inside, however, stopped her cold and set her heart racing. The pages were filled with meticulous handwriting, each entry a snapshot of life observed from the margins. Sarah's eyes scanned the words, and a strange mix of curiosity and unease settled in her chest. Mrs. Henderson's grandson came by today. She smiled for the first time in months. The tenderness of the observation struck her. Someone had noticed, someone had cared enough to write it down. The new attorney's nervous. Hope he finds his footing. The words carried a quiet hope, a wish for someone else's success. Judge Bell looked exhausted today. Wonder if he's sleeping. Sarah paused, her thumb resting on the page. Judge Arthur Bell, the courthouse's towering figure of authority, was someone she saw daily. Yet these words revealed a vulnerability she'd never considered. Who was this person, watching so closely, seeing so much? Then she turned to a page near the back, and the world seemed to tilt. In the same careful script, a single entry stood out like a confession carved in stone. Arthur Bell, Bravo Team 9, Kosovo, 1999. He made it home. That's enough. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Judge Bell, the man whose stern presence commanded the courtroom, had served in Kosovo. In 6 months of working under his watchful eye, she'd never heard a whisper of military service. Her mind raced, piecing together fragments of the judge's demeanor, the way he carried himself with quiet discipline, the occasional far-off look in his eyes. But this was a revelation. She flipped back through the notebook, her fingers trembling as she searched for more. And there they were, scattered like breadcrumbs. Dreamed about the extraction again. Abe was so young then. Heard helicopters today. A.B. flinched during the flyover. He remembers, too. 23 years next month. Wonder if A.B. knows I'm here. Sarah's heart pounded as the weight of what she held sank in. This wasn't just a notebook. It was a bridge between two lives, a fragile thread connecting the city's most respected judge and its most overlooked resident, a man named Raymond Ellis. She'd heard whispers about Raymond, the quiet figure who lingered on the edges of the courthouse, always watching, never speaking. Some called him eccentric, others dismissed him as a drifter. But these pages told a different story. Raymond wasn't just observing, he was carrying a history, a shared past with Judge Bell that stretched back to a war most had forgotten. Kosovo, 1999, Bravo Team 9. The words echoed in her mind, stirring questions she wasn't sure she wanted answered. What had happened there? Why had Raymond chosen to fade into the background, to live as a ghost in a city that revered the man he'd once known? As Sarah stood on the steps, the notebook heavy in her hands, a storm of emotions churned within her. She felt like an intruder, holding someone's deepest thoughts, their private pain. Raymond had chosen invisibility, deliberately shunning recognition or reward. Was it shame, fear, or something more profound, a vow to bear witness in silence? The ethical dilemma clawed at her. As a legal intern, she knew the implications of what she'd found. If Raymond and Judge Bell shared a past, could it compromise the judge's impartiality? Was she obligated to report this, to hand the notebook over to court officials and let the system decide? But as a human being, she felt the weight of something bigger, a story that demanded a different kind of justice, one that honored the quiet dignity of a man who'd chosen to disappear. That evening, Sarah sat at her small kitchen table, the notebook open before her. Her apartment was quiet, but her mind was anything but. She thought of Raymond, picturing him slipping through the courthouse crowds, his eyes sharp but weary. What must it feel like, she wondered, to carry a secret for 23 years? To watch someone you'd known in a moment of life or death intensity rise to prominence while you faded into the shadows? She imagined Raymond's solitude, the way he must have wrestled with his choice to stay hidden. Did he ever regret it? Did he ever wish for someone to see him, truly see him, the way he saw others? And then there was Judge Bell. Sarah thought of the man she'd observed in the courtroom, his voice steady, his rulings precise. But now she saw him differently. A man who'd carried his own burdens, perhaps haunted by the same memories that filled Raymond's dreams. What had Kosovo been like for him? Had he ever looked out at the courthouse steps and sensed Raymond's presence? A ghost from a past he couldn't fully leave behind? Sarah's heart ached for both men, bound by a moment in time, yet separated by years of silence. After hours of wrestling with her conscience, Sarah made a decision that felt both reckless and inevitable. She wouldn't return the notebook to Raymond, nor would she turn it over to the court. Instead, she would take a step that seemed unthinkable just days before. With the notebook tucked under her arm, she walked to Judge Bell's chambers, her pulse racing with every step. When she knocked, the sound echoed in the quiet hallway, and for a moment she considered turning back. But then the door opened, and there stood Judge Bell, his face as composed as ever, though his eyes held a flicker of curiosity. "Your Honor," Sarah said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I think you need to see this." She held out the notebook, and for the first time in the 6 months she'd known him, the judge's mask slipped. His eyes locked on the worn cover, and a wave of emotion crossed his face. Not anger, not surprise, but something raw and unguarded. Recognition. Pain. "Where did you find this?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Raymond Ellis dropped it," Sarah replied, watching his reaction closely. "He's been writing about you for years." Judge Bell's hands trembled slightly as he took the notebook, and Sarah noticed the faint scars on his knuckles, marks she'd never seen before. He opened it to the page she'd marked, the one about Bravo Team 9, and read in silence. For a moment he seemed to disappear into the words, his shoulders sagging under the weight of memory. When he closed his eyes, Sarah saw the glint of tears, and her breath caught. This was no longer the untouchable judge she'd admired from afar. This was a man confronting a past he'd buried deep. When he opened his eyes again, they were wet, but resolute. "I owe that man more than silence." he said, his voice thick with emotion. The words hit Sarah like a revelation, echoing something she'd later learned had been captured by courthouse security cameras, though no one had understood their meaning at the time. She hesitated, then asked, "Your Honor, what happened between you and Raymond?" Judge Bell looked at her, and in that moment Sarah saw a man who'd carried a secret for 23 years and suddenly realized he didn't have to bear it alone. "Miss Martinez," he said, his voice steady now, "tomorrow morning I'm going to tell this courthouse and this community who Raymond Ellis really is." That night, Judge Arthur Bell sat in his study, the notebook open on his desk. The room was lined with legal texts and framed certificates, but tonight they felt like relics of a life built on half-truths. He pulled out files he hadn't touched in over 2 decades, their edges brittle with age. As he read Raymond's careful handwriting, memories of 1999 flooded back, sharp and unrelenting. Kosovo. Lieutenant Arthur Bell, 34, a military advisor during the NATO intervention. Bravo Team 9, a special operations unit tasked with evacuating international observers from a compound under siege. The mission had been a disaster. Faulty intelligence, a compound far more fortified than expected. His team pinned down with wounded civilians and no clear way out. Bell had been young, terrified, and uncertain they wouldn't survive. And then there was Staff Sergeant Raymond Ellis. Bell could still see him, calm under fire, making a choice that saved 17 lives, including Bell's own. Raymond had risked everything, defying orders to hold a position that gave the team the time they needed to escape. Bell had never forgotten the look in Raymond's eyes that day, a quiet resolve, a willingness to sacrifice himself for others. But after the war, their paths had diverged. Bell had risen through the ranks, while Raymond had vanished, choosing a life of obscurity. Bell's heart ached with the question as he read Raymond's entries, each one a testament to a man who'd never stopped watching, never stopped caring. As the night wore on, Bell's thoughts turned to Sarah Martinez. He admired her courage, the way she'd brought him the notebook instead of hiding from its truth. She'd given him a chance to honor Raymond, to finally speak the debt he'd carried in silence for so long. For the first time in years, Judge Bell felt a glimmer of peace, mingled with the pain of memory. Tomorrow he would step into his courtroom and tell Raymond's story, not just for himself, but for the man who'd once saved him, and for a young intern who'd reminded him what justice truly meant. The memory of that day lingered in Bell's mind like a wound that refused to heal. The explosion had ripped through the air, a deafening roar that left his ears ringing for days. Smoke choked the sky, thick and acrid, obscuring everything but the chaos. Through that haze, Raymond Ellis emerged, a figure of quiet resolve, carrying Bell over his shoulder as shrapnel tore into his own back. The pain must have been excruciating, yet Raymond's steps never faltered. He returned to the burning compound not once but 3 times, each trip a defiance of the gunfire that sought to claim him. He pulled wounded soldiers from the wreckage, his strength and courage a lifeline in a mission that, according to official records, never happened. The classified report buried Raymond's heroism in files sealed for a quarter century, leaving his sacrifices to fade into silence. Bell could still see Raymond in the hospital afterward, his body bandaged but his spirit far more broken. The young sergeant sat by the window, staring at a world that seemed to have forgotten him. His eyes held a depth of pain that went beyond the physical, wounds carved by the weight of saving lives in a war that officially didn't exist. "I can't go home and pretend this didn't matter," Raymond had said, his voice low, almost lost in the hum of the hospital. "But I can't go home and tell the truth either." Those words haunted Bell, a quiet confession of a man caught between duty and invisibility. Bell had promised to stay in touch, a vow made with the sincerity of someone who believed time wouldn't erode it. They all had, comrades bound by shared sacrifice, but the life of a special operations soldier scatters like seeds carried off by a restless wind. Bell returned to a world that welcomed him, finishing law school, building a career, raising a family. Raymond's name faded into the background, a memory tucked away until fate forced it back into the light. Now, years later, Judge Bell stood at the threshold of a moment that felt like redemption. He arrived at the courthouse earlier than usual, his heart heavy with purpose. The night before, he'd made phone calls, pulling strings to declassify fragments of Raymond's service record. It wasn't enough to rewrite history, but it was a start. By 9 o'clock p.m., Courtroom 3 buzzed with anticipation. Word had spread that Judge Bell was about to make an unprecedented announcement about the homeless man who had collapsed during testimony the day prior. Raymond sat in the back row as he always did, unnoticed and unassuming, his weathered face betraying no hint of the storm about to break over him. Bell entered, his black robes flowing, but there was a shift in his demeanor. The stern, detached judge was gone, replaced by a man carrying the weight of a truth too long suppressed. His heart pounded, not with fear, but with the urgency of setting something right. "Ladies and gentlemen," Bell began, his voice steady but laced with emotion, "before we proceed with today's docket, I have an announcement to make." His eyes found Raymond, who shifted uncomfortably under the sudden spotlight. The courtroom felt smaller, the air charged with curiosity. "Yesterday, a man collapsed in this very room. Some of you saw it. Many have seen the videos circulating online. There's been talk, speculation about his credibility, his character, his right to be here." Bell paused, his gaze locked on Raymond, who seemed to shrink under the weight of attention. "I'm here to set the record straight, Ad. That man is Staff Sergeant Raymond Ellis, United States Army Special Operations, recipient of the Bronze Star and Purple Heart, a man who, in '99, saved 17 lives in Kosovo, including mine." The courtroom erupted in whispers, a ripple of shock spreading through the crowd. Bell raised a hand, commanding silence. His voice grew firmer, each word deliberate. "Sergeant Ellis served this country with extraordinary courage in operations most of you will never know existed. When he returned home, he carried wounds that no medical report could capture and honors that could never be displayed. For 23 years, I have lived a life made possible by his sacrifice. I went to law school, built a career, raised a family, and served this community as a judge. All because a young soldier decided my life was worth saving." His voice cracked slightly, betraying the depth of his gratitude. Raymond's face was a storm of emotions: shock, recognition, and something softer, like the flicker of a memory long buried. Bell stepped down from the bench, his movements deliberate, purposeful. The crowd parted as he walked toward Raymond, each step closing the distance between their shared past and this moment of reckoning. "For 23 years, Bell continued, his voice now carrying the weight of confession, that same soldier has been invisible in this community. He slept on our streets, cleaned our courthouse steps without pay, asked for nothing, and received nothing in return." The words hung heavy, a quiet indictment of a society that had overlooked its hero. Bell stopped at Raymond's row, his hands steady as he reached into his robes and produced a small velvet box. He opened it to reveal a Bronze Star medal gleaming alongside an official certificate. The crowd fell silent, the air thick with reverence. "This medal," Bell said, his voice soft but resolute, "was awarded to Sergeant Ellis in '99 for gallantry in action against an armed enemy. It was lost when his personal effects were stolen years ago." He held the box out to Raymond, whose hands trembled as he reached for it, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. In that moment, the courtroom wasn't just a room. It was a space where a weedy, overdue debt was finally acknowledged, where a man who had given everything was seen, at last, for who he truly was. The air in the courtroom hung heavy with anticipation, a stillness that seemed to hold its breath as Judge Bell's voice, steady yet resonant with conviction, filled the space. His words carried the weight of a man who had seen too much to remain silent any longer. "The Department of Defense, at my personal request, has corrected an injustice long overdue," he declared, his tone sharpening with purpose. He stood at the bench, not as a figure of authority draped in robes, but as a man stripped bare by gratitude, his eyes fixed on a truth he could no longer ignore. "I stand before you not as your judge, but as someone whose life was spared because of the courage of a man this community has chosen to forget." His gaze softened, sweeping toward the back of the room where a lone figure sat, shoulders hunched under the weight of years and neglect. With a deliberate gesture, he beckoned Raymond Ellis to rise. Raymond hesitated, his calloused hands gripping the edge of the worn wooden bench. The fabric of his faded jacket seemed to carry the story of his life, threadbare, overlooked, yet enduring. Slowly he stood, and in that moment something shifted within him. His posture straightened, not with pride, but with a quiet dignity that had been buried under decades of indifference. The courtroom, usually alive with murmurs or the shuffle of papers, fell into a profound silence, as if the very walls were watching. Judge Bell's voice cut through the quiet, each word deliberate, almost reverent. Sergeant Ellis has never sought glory. He has never demanded gratitude or recounted his sacrifices for pity. He has carried his burdens in silence, not because he chose it, but because this world gave him no other option. The judge's hands trembled slightly as he lifted a small, polished box from the bench, revealing a bronze star that gleamed under the courtroom's muted lights. But silence is not always a virtue, and some debts cannot be repaid with apathy. He stepped forward, the medal in hand, and approached Raymond with a steadiness that belied the emotion welling in his chest. Raymond stood motionless, his weathered face a map of unspoken trials. As Judge Bell pinned the medal to his jacket, the faint clink of metal against fabric echoed in the stillness. The judge's hands were firm, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of vulnerability, a gratitude too deep for words. "By the authority of this court and in the presence of this community," he said, his voice rising, "I restore to Staff Sergeant Raymond Ellis the recognition he never sought but has always deserved." The courtroom remained frozen, every pair of eyes locked on the scene. For Raymond, the weight of the medal was more than physical. It was the weight of being seen, of being remembered, after years of fading into the background of a town that had moved on without him. Judge Bell stepped back, his gaze lingering on Raymond. "This courtroom owes him more than silence," he said, repeating the cryptic phrase that had hung in the air the previous day, puzzling those who heard it. "It owes him respect. It owes him dignity. It owes him the acknowledgement that 23 years of neglect can never erase." His words were a challenge, a plea, a reckoning. For Raymond, they were a lifeline. For the first time in decades, he lifted his head, his eyes meeting those of the people around him. They were not the eyes of a broken man, but of someone who had carried an invisible burden and, in this moment, felt its weight lift ever so slightly. He didn't speak. Words had long ceased to be his currency, but his gaze held a quiet strength, a flicker of something reclaimed, something that had been lost in the long, lonely years. Sarah Martinez was the first to rise. A young law student who had stumbled upon Raymond's story by chance, she stood with a mixture of awe and resolve, her heart pounding with the realization that she was witnessing something sacred. Her discovery of Raymond's notebook, a tattered collection of thoughts and memories scribbled in the margins of his life, had set this moment in motion. She felt a surge of pride, not for herself, but for the man who had unknowingly changed her understanding of justice. Judge Bell followed, standing at attention with the rigidity of a soldier honoring a comrade. One by one, the others in the courtroom rose, lawyers, clerks, spectators, even those who had never met Raymond's gaze before. It wasn't applause that filled the room, but a silent, collective acknowledgement, a recognition not of his story's details, but of his undeniable worth. In that shared act of standing, they offered what Milfield had withheld for too long: respect. The moment lingered, heavy and unbroken, until the gavel fell, signaling the end of the session. But the ripple of that day extended far beyond the courthouse walls. By evening, a video of Judge Bell's announcement had spread across social media, racing through the digital veins of Milfield and beyond. Unlike the usual courthouse gossip, petty scandals, or legal squabbles, this was a story of redemption, of a truth buried for decades and finally unearthed. Within 48 hours, national news outlets had picked it up, their headlines proclaiming, "Judge honors homeless veteran who saved his life." For once, the news cycle, so often fractured by division, carried a story that stitched people together, reminding them of the quiet heroes living in plain sight. In Milfield, the impact was deeper, more personal. The town, once content to let Raymond fade into the margins, began to stir. A week after the courtroom revelation, a small group of residents launched a fundraising campaign with a simple yet ambitious goal: to transform Raymond's old apartment building, abandoned for 3 years and marked for demolition, into a community library for veterans. The building, owned by the county, had been Raymond's home until 8 years prior, when life's relentless pressures had forced him out. The idea struck a chord, and within days, the county commissioners voted unanimously to donate the property to the cause. The Veterans Community Library, as it was named, became a symbol of Milfield's awakening, a chance to right a wrong, not just for Raymond, but for all those whose sacrifices had gone unnoticed. Sarah Martinez, whose discovery of Raymond's notebook had sparked this change, took on the role of library coordinator. She had recently received a scholarship from a veterans advocacy group, a ticket to law school, and a future she had long dreamed of. But she chose to defer her studies for a year, driven by a conviction that this work, honoring Raymond and others like him, was a higher calling. "I've learned more about justice in the past week than in 2 years of law school," she told the local paper, her voice steady but her eyes bright with purpose. "Justice isn't always about winning cases. Sometimes it's about making sure the right people are remembered, that their stories don't vanish." Her words resonated, echoing the quiet power of Raymond's own silence. The library took 3 months to renovate, a labor of love fueled by community donations and volunteer hands. During that time, Raymond continued his daily routine, sweeping the courthouse steps with the same quiet diligence he had always shown. But something had changed. Sarah had asked him to help select books and resources for the library, a request that caught him off guard. It was the first time in years anyone had sought his opinion, had treated him as someone whose voice mattered. Each time he offered a suggestion, a book on military history, a guide for veterans navigating civilian life, he felt a small piece of himself return, like a puzzle slowly coming together. On the library's opening day, Sarah unveiled a framed page from Raymond's notebook, hung prominently on the main wall. The words, written in his careful, slanted script, read, "Nobody needs to know, but if just one person remembers, I won't completely disappear." Below it, a small placard declared, "In honor of all veterans whose stories deserve to be preserved." For Raymond, seeing those words displayed was both humbling and overwhelming. He stood before the frame, his fingers brushing the edge of his bronze star, and for a moment he allowed himself to feel the weight of being remembered. One crisp morning, as Raymond swept the courthouse steps, a stranger approached. The man, middle-aged and dressed in a modest suit, carried an air of quiet respect. He paused, studying Raymond with a look that held no pity, only recognition. "Sergeant Ellis," he said softly, extending a hand, "I just wanted to say thank you." Raymond, unaccustomed to such gestures, nodded, his grip firm but his eyes wary. The man didn't linger, but his words stayed with Raymond, a small spark in the quiet of his routine. It was one of many moments in the weeks that followed, as Milfield began to see him not as the man who swept their steps, but as the hero who had always been there, waiting to be remembered. The man stood in the doorway, his hands fidgeting with a small white card, his face etched with unease. He cleared his throat softly, the sound barely audible over the quiet hum of Raymond Ellis's work. "Mr. Ellis," he began, his voice trembling with hesitation, as though each word carried the weight of a long-buried regret. I'm not sure if you'd remember me. I was one of those people online talking about you. I said some things I shouldn't have." Raymond paused, his hands stilling over the papers on his desk. He lifted his gaze, studying the stranger's face. The man's features didn't spark recognition, but the raw sincerity in his eyes told Raymond everything he needed to know. This was a man grappling with his own missteps, standing here to make amends. Raymond's heart stirred, not with anger, but with a quiet understanding forged by years of being misunderstood. "I was wrong," the man continued, his voice steadier now, as if confessing had unlocked something within him. "I judged you without knowing a thing about you. I believed the worst, and I'm sorry for that." He extended the white card toward Raymond, his hand trembling slightly. Raymond accepted it, his calloused fingers brushing against the smooth paper. In simple, unadorned handwriting, 3 words stood out. "I was wrong." The man didn't linger for a reply. He turned and walked away, his shoulders hunched as if carrying the weight of his apology into the world beyond. Raymond held the card, staring at it for a long moment. A flicker of emotion, something between relief and disbelief, in face a moment, warmed his chest. He slipped the card into his shirt pocket, its presence a quiet reminder that even in a world quick to judge, some hearts could still find their way back to truth. On a brisk January morning, the Veterans Community Library opened its doors. The ceremony was modest by design, a deliberate rejection of pomp and publicity. No politicians clamored for photo ops, no news vans crowded the street. Instead, a small gathering of souls stood together, bound by a shared understanding of the moment's significance. Raymond was there, his weathered face softened by the occasion. Sarah Martinez, his steadfast ally, stood nearby, her eyes bright with pride. Judge Bell, the man who'd once stepped down from his bench to speak Raymond's truth, offered a quiet nod of respect. Around them, 20 community members mingled, their presence a testament to the power of a story reclaimed. But the heart of the day belonged to the 15 children from Jefferson Elementary School. Their teacher, Mrs. Nguyen, had brought them here to witness something more than a building's debut. She wanted them to learn about the man whose quiet resilience had inspired it. The children, with their bright eyes and boundless curiosity, followed Sarah on a tour of the library. They ran their fingers over the spines of books in the cozy reading nook, where soft chairs invited lingering. They paused at the military history section, where stories of valor and sacrifice waited to be discovered. And they gazed in awe at the wall where a single page from Raymond's notebook hung framed, its words a quiet testament to the enduring value of every life story. As the tour drew to a close, something unexpected unfolded. The children formed a line and began filing past Raymond, who stood near the entrance, his hands clasped tightly to steady his nerves. He hadn't expected much from the day. Just to see the library come to life was enough. But then the first child, a girl of perhaps 8 with braids swinging gently, stopped before him. She looked up, her face solemn, and placed her small hand over her heart, a gesture she'd learned in school, where she'd stood tall for during the Pledge of Allegiance. The simplicity of it stole Raymond's breath away. One by one, the other children followed. 14 more young hearts, each pausing to offer the same gesture, a silent tribute to Raymond. Their hands rested briefly over their chests, their eyes meeting his with his own, carrying a respect they couldn't fully comprehend, but felt compelled to express. For Raymond, time seemed to slow. For 8 long years, children had crossed the street to avoid him, their parents tugging them away from the scary homeless man with his worn jacket and haunted eyes. Those moments had carved deep wounds, invisible but heavy, into his soul. Now, here were these children, unprompted, unscripted, honoring him simply because they'd heard his story. His throat tightened and his eyes glistened with the weight of their kindness. When the last child had passed, Raymond stood still, his heart swelling with a mix of gratitude and disbelief. He looked around the library, taking in the shelves lined with books that would carry the stories of other veterans, the chairs that offered a haven for reflection and healing, and the framed page of his own words, a reminder that every life story mattered. Sarah approached, her smile warm and knowing. "What do you think?" she asked, her voice soft but expectant. Raymond didn't answer right away. His thoughts swirled, too vast for words at first. Then slowly he reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out the white card from that morning. He held it gently as if it were a fragile piece of hope. "I think," he said, his voice measured but rich with emotion, "that saying you were wrong sometimes takes more strength than being right from the start." He glanced at the card, then met Sarah's gaze. "But both of them matter. They matter a lot." That evening, Raymond sat in one of the library's plush chairs, surrounded by the faint scent of new books and the lingering echo of the children's gestures. For the first time in 3 months, he opened his notebook and began to write. His pen moved steadily, each word a quiet triumph. "Sometimes justice doesn't come when you expect it," he wrote. "But when it does, it brings more than you could have dreamed. It brings the next generation, learning to see, learning to remember." He paused, his eyes drifting to the framed page on the wall, then added, "Maybe that's enough to build something lasting." Outside, the courthouse steps awaited their morning sweep, as they had for 23 years. But within the walls of the Veterans Community Library, a different kind of service was taking root. A service of memory, of storytelling, of ensuring that those who'd been cast aside would never again be forgotten. Raymond Ellis had never sought to be remembered. For over 2 decades, he'd swept those steps, carrying secrets that officially didn't exist, his service hidden beneath a worn jacket and the weight of invisible wounds. When society turned its back, when snap judgments replaced curiosity, he'd borne it all in silence. It took a judge stepping down from his bench to remind the world that heroes don't always adorned with medals or cloaked in glory. Sometimes they carry brooms and broken dreams. The viral video that had upended Raymond's life spread because it captured something rare, a moment when truth shattered prejudice, when recognition pierced the veil of invisibility. It showed a community awakening to the truth that worth isn't measured by outward appearances, but by the quiet dignity of a life lived with purpose. Some debts, Raymond knew, could only be repaid with remembrance, with respect, with the understanding that service wears many faces. And in the quiet library, as the children's gestures lingered in his heart, he felt that debt being paid one heartbeat at a time.